Lecture 4. The Buddha, the Middle Way.
Hello, it's good to be back with you again. In the previous lecture, we talked about Mahavira and Jainism. We're going to today talk about the second major heterodox school in India, which is Buddhism. It bills itself as the middle way between extreme asceticism, this was their critique of Mahavira, and ordinary life on the other side. When I teach a course on Buddhism, I usually invite students to try a class assignment at the beginning of the semester. I ask them to try to live like a Buddhist for 3 days, 3 consecutive days, which means no injuring living creatures, eat vegetarian, no stealing, no sexual activity, including no thoughts about sex even, no false speech, and no intoxicants. And for those who say, that's pretty much the way I live now, I say, okay, you can also go further with 3 more extra credit assignments. No eating after noon, so 12 noon, and then you don't eat anymore. Have a big breakfast, though. No entertainments, no music, no dancing, no performances or perfumes or cosmetics, and no oversleeping. Those are for monks, actually. And then I say, I don't care whether you find this pleasant or whether you find it terribly difficult and unpleasant. I mostly just want you to try it out. The point is mindfulness, to try to live your life very mindful of everything that you do. Oftentimes students will try it and then they'll mess up and they'll try again and finally they'll get 3 consecutive days. I once had a student who pointed out that in my original assignment I'd said no accidental killing of insects or creatures. And they said, that's more like Jainism, where you get bad karma even for non-intentional actions. Buddhism is very much attuned towards psychology and to the mind, and intention matters greatly. So according to the Buddha, if you want to kill a fly, say you swat at it and miss, you still get the bad karma for killing it. Whereas if you accidentally kill an animal or an insect, it doesn't matter so much. I'm going to talk today about the basic principles of Buddhism and its appeal. But first we have to start with a review of the Buddha's life story. He was born in modern Nepal, just north of the border with India, lived about 563 to 483 BC, though scholars have sometimes said maybe it's a century later than that. But either way, this was a time of social and intellectual turmoil. He was a contemporary of Mahavira, just about, and he was also a prince. So this is the time, as I said in the earlier lecture, of kingdoms that start to get larger, warfare, there are inequities in society, the caste system is there, and the Vedic religion, right, Brahmanism, which is based on the Vedas, started to be seen as ritual. It didn't have deep spiritual answers. So the first thing that we know about the Buddha, actually the first extended biography, is written by a man named Ashvaghosha in Sanskrit, and it's late. It's like the late 2nd century AD, so that's maybe 700 years after the Buddha's life. But the story is that there was a miraculous birth. Okay, not a virgin birth. His mother was married at the time, but apparently had a hard time getting pregnant and once dreamed of a white elephant that came and entered into her side, and then she found herself pregnant. The real miracle comes later when he's born, because he's born without any pain or discomfort to his mother whatsoever. What a lovely miracle. And then as soon as he was born, he took 7 steps. That would have been unusual. And then he spoke and said, I am born for enlightenment, for the good of the world. This is my last birth. And I'm sure it would have been surprising to his mother to have this young infant start speaking right away. Now, these miracles weren't added later to the story. In the earliest Buddhist texts that we have, the Buddha is sort of more than human, it seems. And his biography begins before he's born. There are lots of stories called Jataka stories about previous existences and lives where he did all sorts of miracles and then was finally born as Siddhartha Gautama in this last incarnation. Shortly after his birth, his mother died, and then he was raised by a stepmother who was also his maternal aunt, right? So his father married his mother's sister after she died. And he had a rather unusual upbringing. There was a prophecy that he would grow up to either be a Chakravartin, which is a great king, or he would grow up to become a holy man. And his father, who was the king, wanted to influence events because he wanted his son to inherit his kingdom and sort of, make it more powerful and larger. So he kept him at the palace, never let him out, and surrounded him with all sorts of luxuries, music and good food, and there were women around, and he got married, and it was just lovely. But he was really curious about what life was like outside of the palace. And so he asked to go on a field trip. And his father sort of arranged things so he wouldn't see any unpleasant sights, but the gods interfered. When he went out, he saw someone who was old. And he said to his chariot driver, "What's wrong with that guy?" And the chariot driver said, "That's what happens to everyone if you're lucky enough to live long enough." He went out again and saw someone who was sick and decrepit. And then he went out again and saw a corpse, the first that he'd ever heard of death. And he realized that the life that he was living was pretty artificial. He went out one more time and he saw a wandering ascetic, a holy man, and he realized that it was possible to achieve peace and contentment even if you're living in a world that's full of suffering. And so he made up his mind that that was the path he was going to take. At the age of 29, when everyone was asleep one night, he left the palace and left his family as well. Now, it's unpleasant to think of the Buddha as a deadbeat dad. He did have a wife and a son, but from an Indian perspective, this is actually a good thing because he's produced an heir for his father. He's done his duty, his family obligation, his dharma, and now can move on. For 6 years, he wandered around with other ascetics, other holy men, and he practiced meditation and fasting. He was very disciplined. He got down to where he was eating, just 1 grain of rice a day, the legends say. But then he came to a limit of his progress. And he said, "I'm not getting any wiser. I'm just hungry." So he started eating again and washing, and his fasting companion said, we knew he didn't have the discipline that it took he couldn't hack it. But the Buddha doesn't care. He vows that he's going to sit underneath a Bodhi tree until he's achieved enlightenment, until he has answers. So he sits down and then he goes into a series of deeper and deeper meditative states where he sees his own previous lives, right, in past incarnations. He sees the previous lives of others, and then he becomes enlightened. The word Buddha means the enlightened one or the awakened one. So he didn't want to just learn how to live with suffering or despite suffering or how to block it out. He wanted to actually eliminate it entirely. Once he became enlightened, his first inclination was just to go into nirvana, and then some of the gods induced him to say, "Stick around and teach your what you've learned to others." And so his first sermon was taught to his 5 former companions at a place called Sarnath in India. You can still go there and see a stupa that commemorates this great occasion when the Buddha set in motion the wheel of the law. He starts everything going. And he spends the next 45 years wandering about, teaching, organizing his followers. At the age of 80, he becomes sick after eating some food that had been offered to him, and then he died. He passed into nirvana. What he taught his disciples in that, well, they weren't his disciples yet, but his old friends in that first sermon was the 4 noble truths. And the 4 noble truths are: all life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. If you stop desire, you can stop suffering. And you can stop desire by following the Eightfold Path. Right? Let me give you an explanation about each of those. All life is suffering. That may be obvious for people who face grinding poverty or malnutrition or disease or abuse or are in war zones or suffer under political oppression. But also for those of us whose suffering comes primarily from interpersonal relationships and health issues. And think about where the suffering in your life would come from. Hopefully, interpersonal relationships, health issues. But life is suffering for those people as well. And partly it's because nothing lasts forever, is one of his great insights. So if you say, my life isn't all suffering, then I would challenge you and say, well, name something that's not suffering. And you might say, ice cream. Or spending time with friends and family. Or, as some of my clever students say, listening to you lecture, Professor Hardy, is not suffering. Okay, I'll grant you that, perhaps. But wherever there are pleasures, they're temporary. And the more you enjoy them, the more you'll miss them when it ends. Everything comes to an end sooner or later. The Buddha described it in this way. Let's see if I can find this. Let me read to you. Birth is suffering, decay is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. That all seems reasonable. The presence of objects we hate is suffering, and separation from objects we love is suffering. Not to obtain what we desire is suffering. So suffering comes from desire. That seems maybe a little strange for us because in our modern economy, there's advertising. I mean, the whole point of advertising is to encourage desires in people who didn't have them before, and that fuels our economy. But in the end, our desires always exceed our resources and leave us unhappy, unsatisfied. One translation of this first noble truth is not just all life is suffering, but all life is unsatisfactory in some ways. You're not going to always get everything that you want. The third noble truth is you can stop suffering by stopping desire. So don't get too attached to material goods or even to people. And the desire for nirvana, the desire to escape desire, can be the kind of desire that might keep you in this cycle of existence. It's a little tricky. So all life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. If you stop desire, you can stop suffering. We're to the fourth noble truth, which is the Eightfold Path, which says right views, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Okay, I know that's a lot to keep in mind. Lots of commentaries on how exactly to do all of those. But basically, that list of 8 can be divided into 3 parts. And the parts are wisdom, right? So right views and right intention, the first 2 things. And then the next 3 have to do with conduct. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood. So you can't be an arms manufacturer. And then the next 3 are mental development, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And these aren't sequential. You can work on all of these things at the same time. So the Buddha has given a diagnosis. I mean, the problem is that life is unsatisfactory. He's told you the cause of this disease and the cure for it, and then he's given a prescription, something you ought to do. He describes it as being like medicine. You have to actually put this into practice. The Buddha didn't talk much about nirvana. The word literally means a snuffing out or an extinguishing. But he focuses on the process rather than the goal. Nirvana is some indescribable state. I mean, he asked the question, where does a flame go when it goes out? And that's what nirvana is like. Who knows? But the important thing is focusing on what we can do at this time. So suffering is caused by selfishness. That is the desire for our own pleasure, for well-being, for our own continuance. The Buddha undercuts this with a twist on the metaphysics of the Upanishads. He retains the ideas of samsara, karma, dharma, and moksha. But unlike Hinduism, where people and animals have souls, and Jainism, where everything has a soul, the Buddha taught that nothing has a soul. All sentient beings, all creatures that can perceive, that feel, all sentient beings, including animals and spirits and gods and humans, are composite, transient, and soulless. Any grasping at permanence will end in failure and suffering. Enlightenment is simply the realization that there's no part of you that's eternal and lasting. Instead, you're a combination of the 5 aggregates: a body, feelings, perceptions, dispositions, and consciousness. I'll talk about those in more detail later. And all of those are changing all of the time. So some may outlast your body and be reincarnated in another collection of matter. But if I could overcome the illusion that there's an entity named Grant Hardy who has needs that must be met and ambitions and desires, then my aggregates would simply dissipate at my death, and then I could find, right, but there's no I at that point, but something related to me could find peace and permanence in nirvana. So birth and death and rebirth and all the suffering that goes with them, in the end, come from ignorance. It's the illusion that there's a self and that has needs and can try to find happiness. The solution to selfish desire is the realization that there's no self there. Now, some refinements. I'm going to give you a bunch of lists here. Remember the oral origins of Buddhist teachings. They were passed on by word of mouth for centuries. The three characteristics are all things are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. Right? There's no self in there. And then the five aggregates are sometimes called the skandhas. So you are made up of a body that includes 6 senses, the 5 regular senses, plus your mind, according to the Buddha, is a sense organ that can sense dreams or imagination or mental states. So you're a body, and then you have sensations that come in that are either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. To use a slightly more modern sort of way of thinking about it, you can think about your sensations that are coming in your nervous system all the time. And the next are perceptions. So this is the way you process sense objects and mental objects. You categorize them and label them, saying, that's a dog or a house, or I'm feeling rather uneasy right now or nervous. Okay. So your sensations are coming in, and you can only pay attention to one at a time. This is the perceptions. If I mention it now, you might realize that in addition to hearing the sound of my voice, you can also see whether the temperature is warm or cool, or whether you're hungry or not, or you can feel the pressure of your seat or chair on your rear end. And you only pay attention to some of those. Okay, what do you choose to pay attention to? And that has to do with the fourth of these aggregates, which is psychic dispositions. Those include instincts and habits and impulses and emotions and personality. Have you noticed that some people seem to be happier than others, or some are angry all the time? And I'm not sure that their lives are exactly different, but some people just choose to focus on those events that are frustrating or irritating, and it's a habit of mind, and it colors their personality. The fifth aggregate, the last one, are conscious thoughts, where you actually try to plan out and try to grab onto some of the things that are unpleasant and escape those that are unpleasant. All of those 5 things are changing all the time. There's a Buddhist scripture where a monk goes and talks to a king, and the king says, "How did you get here?" And he says, "In a chariot." And then the question comes up, so what's a chariot? Is it the poles? Is it the wheels, the axle, the chariot body? It's not any one of those. And the king says, so is it, all of those together? No, you can imagine all of those laid out on the ground. It's all of those things together at a particular time and a particular orientation to each other. So that's what you are like. There's no soul, but there's still reincarnation. There's something that passes. Buddhists say it's like a candle lighting another candle. There's no lasting entity that's transferred. Or it's like a rope. There's no, single strand that goes all the way. Things that are wound up together, they end, they continue, but they're joined together into something that has some relationship between the beginning and the end of the rope. Or a more modern example, there's an old joke about George Washington's axe that he supposedly cut down the cherry tree with. Someone says, we've got that in our family. It's been there since George Washington's time. We still use it. We've had to change the handle 4 or 5 times, and the axe head we've changed twice, but it's still the axe. Okay, is it the axe or not? And that's sort of what this is like. Buddhism presents a sophisticated critique of the mind-body dualism. It's just more complicated than that. Okay, some more lists. There are the 4 immeasurables. The Buddhist worldview has been characterized as pessimistic, but he would have called it realistic. I mean, we're able to enjoy what pleasures we do because we're unaware of the costs involved with them and of the future. How much entertainment is escapism? You're trying to forget that someday you and everyone you love will die and things will come to an end. But the Buddha can also be thought of as optimistic. If we strip away our illusions and our ignorance, we can attain the 4 immeasurables, which are friendliness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Now imagine, sort of beyond all of that illusion of self and that driving to do everything, somewhere there is unadulterated friendliness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And doing good to others weakens the hold of egoism and selfish desire. The religion has kindness kind of at its center. So, now that you can recite the 4 Noble Truths, are you enlightened? No. It's like medicine. You have to put it into practice. And Buddhism is the middle way between the extremes of asceticism and materialism. It's challenging, but it's not impossible. So how do you become a Buddhist? First are the three refuges. I told you lots of lists. You acknowledge the Buddha, the Dharma. Remember that meant duty, particularly caste duty in Hinduism. In Buddhism, that means the teachings of the Buddha. So acknowledge the Buddha, Dharma, his teachings, and the Sangha, which is the community of monks and nuns, the three refuges. And then you avoid greed, hate, and delusion, which are the three poisons or the three fires. Okay, what a great list. What are the sources of evil in the world? Is there anything that's not included in greed, hate, and delusion? And then you live a life, as much as you can, of kindness and compassion. So no animal sacrifices. That's going to be a criticism of Vedic religion. They encourage vegetarianism. And all Buddhists take the 5 precepts. We're back to the exercise that I gave my class. No harming or killing, no stealing, no sexual immorality, no lying, and no intoxicants, which sounds like some of the 10 Commandments, maybe not the no intoxicants one. But you don't want to, drink alcohol to forget your troubles in life. You want to focus on those troubles so that you can escape them. As in Jainism, there's an ordinary path and then an extraordinary path. So you might live the best you can and then hope for a better life the next time around. But if you want to become a monk or a nun, you want to move into nirvana directly from this life, there are more rules. Celibacy, strict celibacy. No possessions of any kind, except for, there's several different lists, but basically it's a set of clothes and a change of clothes, 2 robes, sandals, a begging bowl, a razor, glasses. You don't eat after 12 o'clock. So, you can keep your life going, but there's none of this eating as entertainment stuff. No music, no dancing or other entertainments, no ornamentation. So monks and nuns shave their heads, and no use of money. And then they beg for food, but it's not like asking strangers for things. Rather, they go around and people recognize who they are because of their robes and their shaved heads, and they give them things. They actually don't ask. They just accept what's given. They spend their time in scripture study and in meditation. There are about 250 rules for monks, nearly 350 for nuns. It's a little more difficult. The Buddha himself was a little hesitant to allow nuns into his religion that he was starting. He was perhaps concerned about the vulnerability of single women who were unprotected, or he was concerned about the respectability of this movement that he was started, afraid that people wouldn't support the Sangha if there were rumors about things going on. But for whatever reason, he eventually accepted nuns, and of course there were monks as well. The Sangha, the community of monks and nuns, is the longest continuously existing social organization in the world. Actually, Jainism might also be a competitor for that claim, but that's an astonishing thing, right? Monks ordain other monks who ordain other monks, and that goes back to the Buddha himself. So there's a close connection between the monks and the Buddhist lay people because they beg for their food, and they give people opportunities to gain merit by giving gifts to them, and then they teach the people in return. It's a little bit like professional athletes. So a village might have a monk who lives there, and that monk is capable of doing spiritual achievements that are beyond anything you could do, but you're cheering him on, trying to help him out as much as you can, and hoping for the best, that he will conquer and become enlightened and go into nirvana. Just like perhaps you cheer on your favorite athletes who are doing things down on the basketball court or on the football field that you could never do in a million years. Well, maybe in reverse, maybe in a million years or so. But for this life, you could never do them, but you're happy to cheer them on and to help them as you can by being a fan, buying tickets and watching what goes on. So think of monks as spiritual athletes. Why is Buddhism then so attractive to people? Partly because it's not brand new, right? It still draws on these ideas of samsara and karma and dharma, though there's some redefinitions there for how those go. And then this idea of moksha or nirvana, which again is not a place. It's hard to even talk about it as a state of being. You can't really say much about it at all. And the Buddha didn't say much about it. There's also a certain urgency that comes. There's a famous sermon that the Buddha teaches called the Fire Sermon, where he says, You're on fire. Your senses are burning with passion and desire and hatred and delusion. So you need to do something about that. Notice that he's tying into Vedic imagery. There were the fires that accompanied sacrifice. And he says, no, your whole life is on fire. Buddha was agnostic on many issues. He acknowledged that there were gods, but they're themselves in a cycle of birth and rebirth and death, and they're not all that important for liberation. They can't be enlightened for you. You have to follow the example of the Buddha yourself. There are also heavens, multiple heavens, and multiple hells, but they're not permanent. So you may be a terrible person and die and then be reborn into a Buddhist hell. And then you'll be there for a while, suffering terribly, doing all those hellish things, sort of like in Dante. But that's not forever. You'll eventually die in the hell and then be reborn, perhaps again to this world, as a human being, maybe as an animal, whatever your karma gives you. Another reason that the Buddha was successful in teaching was that he taught in local languages. Rather than Sanskrit, which was the classical ancient language that the Vedas were written in, that the Brahmins used, he taught people in languages that they could understand. Later on, those are going to become written down in a language called Pali, which is a literary language that's related to those vernacular languages. And the scriptures are sometimes wonderful in Buddhism. Let me give you an example from the Dhammapada. The thirst of a thoughtless man grows like a creeper. He runs from life to life like a monkey seeking fruit in the forest. Whomsoever this fierce thirst overcomes, full of poison, in this world his sufferings increase like the abounding Baruna grass. He who overcomes this fierce thirst, difficult to be conquered in this world, sufferings fall off from him like water drops from a lotus leaf. What a lovely image. Like water drops from a lotus leaf, your suffering will come off. Or describing people like as a monkey, sort of running here and there and everywhere, trying to get what they want, and it will never work out for them. Most people are interested in suffering, issues of suffering, and how to get out of that, how to escape that. So that's kind of attractive to people. And the Buddha has this idea that the main problem is ignorance. It's not as in some Western religions where the basic human problem is sin or it's pride. You just don't know what's really happening. There's a story about Kisa Gotami, who was a young mother who had a son who died. And she was, of course, devastated by this. And she went around to people saying, "Can you please heal my son?" And people would look at her and say, "Your son's already dead. There's nothing we can do." But she was beside herself, and finally they said, "Why don't you go talk to the Buddha? He knows about this sort of stuff." So she went to the Buddha and asked him to help her. And he said, "First, I need you to go find some mustard seeds. But I want you to find mustard seeds from homes in which no one has died and bring those back to me." So she went from house to house and said, "I need to do something for my son. Would you please give me some mustard seed?" And they'd say, "Sure, we can help out." And she said, "But I need it to be from a home where no one has encountered any death." And people would say, "That wouldn't be here. Maybe try someplace else." Okay, after she goes all over, she realizes that there's no homes that are entirely free from death and from sorrow. She realized it's not just you. This problem isn't just special to you. And she then buried her son and returned to the Buddha, and eventually became enlightened. So the solution is knowledge. It's understanding how the world works. And there's an understanding the causes of suffering, and then also how suffering can be stopped as well. It's a very logical, systematic analysis. It also is consistent enough that the Buddha says that Buddhism itself will come to an end someday. He didn't claim special revelation or divine authority. He just figured out how the world was. One more thing that people like about Buddhism is it's empirical and practical. In the Kalama Sutra, the Buddha said to the Kalama people, "Don't believe just because you hear something, or because it's tradition, or it sounds reasonable, or it's in the scriptures, or because your teacher said it. You need to try it out yourself." And so Buddhists follow the example of Buddha. Like him, they have to awaken to this dilemma of the world, that they're on fire, They become aware of the falseness of ordinary life, and then they have to give it up. It's not exactly like wearing a WWJD bracelet. What would Jesus do? Christians want to follow the example of Jesus in some ways, but they don't want to follow the example in actually suffering for the sins of the world. And no one can do that, just Jesus can do that. Whereas with Buddhism, you actually follow the Buddha through every step that he took. You become enlightened in the same way that he became enlightened. His last words as he died, as he went off into nirvana, were, "And now, O monks, I take my leave of you. All the constituents of being are transitory. Work out your salvation with diligence." All things, whether good or bad, eventually come to an end, including this lecture. But we're not done with the course yet. Next time, we'll talk about the Bhagavad Gita, a book that was, at least in part, a response to the challenges posed by Buddhism. See you then.